To avoid missing our team's films, featuring the latest developments and unique updates on the Israeli war, subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and click the super thanks button below. According to Gaza border evacuees, Israel's limited ground incursion has begun. According to survivors, hundreds of military personnel are waiting outside Be'eri while terrorists remain inside. Heavy battles continue in Gaza's northern and eastern areas. However, some Hamas terrorists have attempted to launch attacks from the tunnels. The Israeli army continues to withstand many attacks while making slow progress. First and foremost, we always state that we oppose all wars and pro-war policies and are in favor of world peace. The operation's main assault has begun. The third offensive split the Gaza Strip down the middle. The initial attack was launched by Israeli forces from the east of Gaza into the cities. The second attack, which began with an Israeli tank convoy yesterday, took place today in Gaza's northernmost sector. All contact was cut off after the third operation, and Gaza was completely surrounded. The situation is critical, as the most violent battles in recent memory have taken place. The Hezbollah terrorist organization expanded its attacks on Israel's north during this period, while the most thorough campaign against Hezbollah was launched. Israeli tanks, bombers, and helicopters crossed into Lebanon. Hezbollah has suffered tremendous casualties, and major attacks continue at a breakneck pace. Let's begin with our video. To begin, it is widely known that Israeli tanks and infantry are moving in an area around 7 kilometers north of Gaza. Tunnels belonging to the terrorist organization Hamas were destroyed. Israeli soldiers pushed along the northern border yesterday, but only 7 kilometers along the shore. Israeli forces were spotted gathering in the north of Gaza today, prior to the launch of the third assault. A large number of Israeli military personnel were stationed in the area around the border crossings. As Israel's presence on the border grew, artillery bombardment of the Beit Hanun region intensified. After destroying Hamas targets, Israeli soldiers began marching towards the city. After a short time, however, a large infantry battalion of Israeli soldiers began to deploy on the coastal stream. I believe that the deployment of Israeli soldiers in 2 locations, as well as the concentration of infantry on 2 critical lines, anticipated a much larger third operation. Following the cessation of artillery shelling of Israeli soldiers in the Beit Hanun area, infantry and armored vehicles arrived unexpectedly at the city border, where resistance organizations affiliated with Hamas terrorists opened fire on Israeli forces, resulting in fighting along the Beit Hanun border. For nearly 2 hours, the Israeli army and Hamas fighters clashed. However, as I stated in my previous 2 documentaries, the Israeli army tracked down the militants at all times. After obtaining a large number of drawn photographs, the pilots launched 66 attacks on Hamas targets. Following the initial clashes, Israeli troops withdrew, knowing that air assaults were imminent. Following the air attacks, Israeli forces moved on the city's outskirts to remove the few remaining Hamas terrorists. The Israeli army pushed closer to the city, resuming supply at the points where the airstrikes were launched. During this time, a large number of air raids were carried out on the coastal strip, with warplanes attacking along the shore, particularly at Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun. The Israeli army appeared to be marching along the coast in order to completely limit Hamas access to the sea. The breaking news, on the other hand, came from the heart of Gaza. Israeli tanks, on the other hand, were seen mobilizing from the Be'eri woods and their surroundings. During the 2 days of fighting on the northern front, Israel's military presence around Be'eri increased substantially. In contrast, Israeli tanks and a large number of troops crossed the border in armored vehicles. Israeli tanks quickly crossed into Gaza. As the tanks rushed to the center, they were met by a bonfire from the surrounding region. The Merkava tanks, on the other hand, passed through the Johor Attic region and reached the main route that connects the Gaza Strip's north and south. The highway was also completely shut down. Thousands of Israeli infantrymen crossed the border, including armored vehicles. The infantry was spotted marching to Johor Point throughout this operation. Hamas militants launched a ferocious counteroffensive. During this time, militants used 2 large tunnels to get access to the Juhur attic area. The introduction of Israeli forces into the city triggered the most intense battle of the conflict. The city's Hamas resistance was unbreakable. To avoid huge casualties, Israeli soldiers did not penetrate the city core. Despite the fact that the places where Hamas attacked were recognized, in a short amount of time, border artillery batteries fired intensively on Hamas targets. Later, Israeli forces entered the city, resulting in protracted combat. Regardless of the artillery assaults, dozers have closed the exit locations of the Hamas tunnels and demolished the tunnel's departure parts. The Israeli army took control of the city's outskirts, and a sizable number of mechanized brigades, tank battalions, and special forces advanced along the route that the Merkava tanks had opened. After securing the city's perimeter, Israeli special forces entered the city and began clearing operations. Approximately 40 Hamas terrorists were detained during the process in preparation for an attack. It was determined throughout this process that Israeli forces were fired on from within a structure after the troops had evacuated to a secure area. Unmanned aerial vehicles fired armor-piercing ammunition to destroy the Hamas headquarters. Before we get to our main topic, I'd like to let you know that we look at the most recent and trustworthy news for you. We share data from the region's more than 100 reporters as well as military public information systems. It is also worth noting that we work more than 15 hours per day, so who can we turn to for assistance? Please donate by clicking the super thank you button, and please like and support us by leaving a comment on the video. We'll now return to the primary topic of the day. Following that, the second objective of the Merkava tank will be to proceed to the beach. Gaza is currently encircled on all sides except the north-south, east-west, and south-south. If the tanks reach the coast, the Gaza Strip's link from north to south will be broken. The purpose of the infiltration of Israeli tanks from the north yesterday became clear with this operation. At the position highlighted on the map, Israeli tanks advancing north and Merkava tanks traveling east will collide. Following this phase, about half of the Gaza Strip will be prepared for a comprehensive ground operation. Hamas terrorists trapped in the center of the blockade will have no means to escape or seek rescue. Hamas defensive resistance will be significantly weakened if it is weakened in this process, as well as if its supplies are disrupted due to air raids. Following that, Israeli soldiers will start clearing the north of Gaza one by one. Following this approach, the Gaza Strip south can be cleaned. However, if Israel achieves a large success in the middle of Gaza, a major offensive on the southern front may be launched. I predict an all-out assault will be launched all the way to the Egyptian border. In contrast, news of Israel's massive operation prompted other terrorist groups to go on the offensive. Terrorists from Hezbollah launched repeated strikes on the Israeli border from southern Lebanon. Hezbollah's targets were Israeli outposts, and mortars were utilized in almost all of the attacks. Israel dispatched ground and air forces. Following the strikes, Israel launched a synchronized offensive on Lebanon's southern border. Fighter jets attacked Hezbollah targets along the southern border. Israeli tanks then began to target the targets. After crossing the Lebanese border with helicopters for the first time, the Israeli army destroyed 4 Hezbollah camps. Hezbollah launches assaults from Lebanon after each major Israeli operation. Northern Israel has a larger army, artillery, and tanks. With Gaza surrounded and progress being made, Israel may invade Lebanon, since if Israeli forces prevail in the north, they will turn their attention to the south. To deter attacks, they may construct a protected buffer zone along the border. Hezbollah and the Houthis may target Israeli soil directly as Iran attempts to enhance its delivery to terrorist groups in reaction to Israeli actions. As a result, the Israeli Air Force intends to attack maritime terminals in Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Regional tensions are rising on a daily basis. We will provide you with timely and accurate updates throughout the next few hours. We will continue to report events objectively with the use of videos. The previous day, Israeli aircraft destroyed apartments in a refugee camp near Gaza City. Palestinian neighbors worked tirelessly to rescue those trapped beneath the rubble. According to Israel, the hit, which was directed at a senior Hamas leader, destroyed the militant command center as well as an underground tunnel network. This victory delighted the Israeli military. Over the last week, Israeli soldiers have killed key Hamas officials on purpose and on principle. Hamas has suffered greatly. The number of people killed in the Jabalia camp attack is unknown. Dr. Atif al-Khalat, director of a local hospital where the injured were transported, stated hundreds had been injured or killed but could not provide specific figures. According to the Israeli military, dozens of militants, including Hamas, were killed. Israel, as commander in northern Gaza, vigorously defended the attack. According to Israeli military spokesman Jonathan Canrikas, the targeted commander was also a key planner who initiated the war. Canrikas went on to say that the apartment buildings damaged in the incident were only dismantled because the enormous underground Hamas facility was destroyed. Paltel, the Palestinian telecommunications firm, said that internet and cell phone services in Gaza had been completely disrupted. This is the second time in 5 days that Gazans have been cut off from the rest of the world. Earlier in the day, communications were jammed, coinciding with the entry of huge numbers of ground forces into Gaza as Israel declared a new phase of the conflict. Attempts to reach Gaza residents via phone were futile early yesterday morning. On top of that, Israel has won a big victory over Hamas fighters. Despite all of these attacks, Israeli soldiers have secured another big victory. During the Gaza war, Israel blew up the residence of a senior Hamas official in the West Bank for actively attacking the Palestinian group's leadership. On Tuesday, footage released on social media showed the full demolition of Salah al-Aruri's home in Arura, near Ramallah. Al-Aruri is the deputy chairman of Hamas Political Bureau and is thought to be residing in exile in Lebanon. He and his family were not at home at the time of the incident. Israeli authorities took al-Aruri's home 10 days ago, claiming that it was being used as an intelligence headquarters. Correspondent Bernard Smith has made a few comments on the subject. The act of blowing up this house was more symbolic. Of course, thereafter al-Aruri. Al-Aruri is widely regarded as one of the true masterminds behind the October 7 Hamas attack on Israeli territory. Israel also announced the death of another Hamas member. The Israeli military also claimed that airstrikes killed Nassim. Abu Ajana is the commander of Hamas's Beit Lahia battalion in the northern sector. Ajana, according to Israel, was involved in the development of Hamas drone and paragliding capabilities. According to the Israeli military and the Israel Security Agency, the removal of Ajana greatly hinders Hamas terrorist organization's efforts to disrupt IDF's ground operations. Israel targeted Hamas leaders as ground soldiers entered Gaza for the 4th night in a row yesterday. This is the most serious escalation in the 3-week conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared the death of Hamas fighters and authorized the Air Force to conduct real-time strikes on targets. Several confrontations occurred during the attack, with Israeli forces coming under anti-tank missile and machine gun fire. Hamas claimed responsibility for the destruction of an Israeli armored vehicle east of Gaza's Erez border station. Netanyahu has routinely rejected calls for a ceasefire. After 3 weeks of non-stop bombings in Gaza that killed at least 8,000 people, Netanyahu declared that this would never happen again. Calls for a ceasefire are a plea for Israel to surrender to Hamas, according to Netanyahu. Meanwhile, the Israeli army announced 9 more soldiers were killed in confrontations in northern Gaza yesterday. With these casualties, the Israeli army has suffered 11 casualties since the start of the ground campaign. Hagari reaffirmed his appeal for the people of northern Gaza to evacuate. To the south, the army claims to be targeting Hamas fighters and infrastructure and that militants are operating among them, putting civilians in danger. The army has also stated repeatedly that it will strike Hamas wherever it can find them. Some 800,000 Palestinians are said to have fled, but many more have not. This is largely due to the fact that Israeli airstrikes in the south continue to kill civilians. As Israeli soldiers approached Gaza's major north-south highway this week, the window of opportunity for escape appeared to be narrowing. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, over 8,500 Palestinians, largely minors, have been murdered in the conflict, with Israeli soldiers making no distinction between inhabitants and fighters. This figure has never been seen before in decades of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On the Israeli side, almost 1,400 people were murdered. The vast majority of them were victims of the initial Hamas onslaught. This is also a record-breaking figure for Israel. During their attacks, Palestinian militants also kidnapped over 240 people and continued to fire rockets into Israel. A day after Israel successfully rescued a Hamas captive for the first time, a spokesman for the militant group's arms section announced that several non-Israeli hostages will be released in the coming days. Previously, Hamas had freed 4 hostages and offered to free others in exchange for thousands of Palestinian detainees held by Israel. This offer, however, was turned down. More than half of Gaza's 2.3 million Palestinian residents have fled. Hundreds of thousands of people have sought safety at United Nations-run schools and clinics, which have also been converted into shelters. The war has increased the risk of combat on other fronts. Along the border, Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah armed groups exchange frequent fire. Israel and the U.S. are bombing targets in Syria that are related to Iran, which backs Hamas, Hezbollah, and other armed groups in the region. Approximately 200,000 people have been evacuated from Israeli towns near Gaza and Lebanon's northern border. As Israeli troops advance deeper into Gaza with the goal of eradicating Hamas, the world's attention is focused on Israel's northern border, where Israeli forces have been engaged in weeks of violent combat with a more powerful foe, the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. Since its allies Hamas conducted a lethal surprise strike on Israel, Hezbollah has found itself in an untenable situation. After years of planning for conflict with Israel, Hezbollah is now caught between preserving its reputation and attacking Israel. Hezbollah has characterized itself as a resistance movement dedicated to defending Lebanon, battling Israel, and supporting the Palestinian cause for statehood across its 40-year history. However, following 3 days of Israeli ground attacks on Gaza and a Palestinian death toll of over 8,000, Hezbollah's response has been scary but measured. Hezbollah's balancing act reflects the organization's significant role in Lebanon, a small and dysfunctional country on Israel's northern border. It is the most powerful political and military force in Lebanon. This means that even the Lebanese government cannot control its decisions, even if they have far-reaching consequences for the entire country. Hezbollah is also the most powerful node in the Middle East's network of Iranian-backed militias, including Hamas. This means that its calculations frequently extend beyond Lebanon's boundaries. But if Hezbollah sits on the sidelines of the battle, will it lose its credibility as the spearhead of the so-called Axis of Resistance movement? While Israel's Air Force annihilates most of Gaza, the most clear fact is that the innocent people of Gaza are in a very terrible situation. The first step is to offer them adequate assistance. It is now official. The siege of Gaza has been lifted. The Israeli army has officially confirmed that the first stage of the operation has been completed. It made 3 major advances, but the Great War has now begun. The most tough part of the process has begun. The Israeli army has advanced to the city, and record-breaking fighting has commenced, with Israeli forces having completed the first stage of the operations. With the onset of highly violent fighting in both Gaza and the West Bank, the Hezbollah terrorist group took action, while Hezbollah launched successive attacks with mortars from the south of Lebanon. It was seen that Israeli forces retaliated, and airstrikes commenced, with all camps along the borders being targeted. The terrorist organization Hezbollah is set to declare war on Israel on Friday at noon. Yemen began launching cruise missiles as all terrorist organizations were in uproar. The F-35s took the stage. This is the war's most crucial day. Let's get our video started as soon as possible. First and foremost, the Great Change began in Gaza. Israeli tanks and a huge number of infantry began their final preparations as the sun rose. During the night, Israeli forces in the central section of Gaza were witnessed making large supplies. Simultaneously, brief battles erupted in Gaza's south, and air attacks continued. With the first rays of sunlight, suddenly, a significant number of Merkava tanks and soldiers headed towards the beach strip. The whole distance of the advance was 4 kilometers, therefore, the unexpected raid arrived at the coastline fast. Meanwhile, the Hamas-terrorist organization's Al-Qassam brigades launched anti-tank missiles on the Juhur Adik area on the eastern front, where the Israeli army first began to advance. The main issue is that the Israeli army now has complete control of the Juhur Adik district. During this process, it was discovered that Hamas was using tunnels in the area. Hamas militants launched attacks in Juhur Adik from within Nusayrat, using the tunnels marked with a red line on the map. According to the Israeli General Staff, 1 tank was destroyed, but the tank was promptly returned to Israeli land, and repair work began. There were no casualties among the tank's crew. Following this, Israeli Army special troops advanced towards the tunnel location. Unmanned aircraft vehicles acquired photographs from the area for 6 hours. While the exact coordinates of the tunnel have been determined, Hamas fighters attempt to conceal the underground entrances by covering them with many plants. However, when the spot was discovered, special troops opened fire on the insurgents around the tunnel. Following a brief fight, the soldiers withdrew and, using drones and armor-piercing bullets, demolished the tunnel entrance and the majority of the tunnel line heading to New Syria. Later, special forces arrived at the tunnel perimeter and began inspecting the tunnel. According to reports, 34 members of the Hamas movement were killed. On the other hand, the operation's major stage has officially begun. As I said in previous films, when Israeli forces neared the coast, those on the northern line began to advance south. New reserve units joined the Israeli military. However, the area shown on the map is around 4 to 5 kilometers in size, and several unmanned aerial vehicles have begun to observe it. Following the completion of the observations, it was discovered that the drones approaching the area were equipped with ammo, and attacks commenced around the shoreline. Following the unmanned aerial vehicle attacks, Israeli artillery on the northern and southern lines began to bombard the coastline. The fact that airstrikes have already been conducted in the 4-kilometer radius indicates that the ground operation will begin soon, approximately 1 hour after the airstrikes have been concluded. The first move originated on the northern line. Tanks and armored vehicles from Israel moved. The forces in the south were seen moving. The Israeli soldiers in the south have most likely completed the objectives that must be met today. Meanwhile, the resting soldiers in the north began to advance south. I believe the forces in the south will advance northward tomorrow. Before we get into our important topic, I'd like to point out that we monitor and evaluate current and accurate news for you. Every second counts. We disseminate information gathered from more than 100 reporters and military public information systems around the region. It's also worth noting that we work more than 15 hours a day, so if you want to help, please donate by clicking the super thank you button, and you can also like and support us by commenting on the video. And now we'll get back to the main topic of the day. On the third major point, Israeli tanks have taken the entrance to Beit Hanun, but fierce combat has erupted. Because there are tunnels belonging to the Hamas terrorist organization all over the city, the infantry is stationed a little further away from the points of assault. During this time, Hamas fighters exited through 2 tunnels behind the tanks and opened fire on Israeli forces. When the confrontations began, rapid air backup was needed, and 2 unmanned aerial vehicles struck the source of the strikes. As a result of the incident, Hamas members were declared neutralized. The Israeli forces were dispatched in response to the Hamas strike. Extensive artillery and airstrikes were launched at a location near Beit Hanun's center. The missile launchers and ammunition dumps of Hamas were hit. Following the attacks, Israeli tanks were seen approaching the center line's border. As the intensity of the operation in Gaza increased, militants launched attacks in a variety of locations. First, Palestinian resistance forces in the West Bank opened fire on an Israeli checkpoint at al-Sharia. After the checkpoint was attacked, violent fighting erupted in the Ramallah area. The combat has intensified as Israeli forces advance to the center. However, new Israeli forces were seen entering the checkpoint, and fighting erupted at the Betunia crossing. According to the initial reports, 8 militants from opposition groups were killed. However, Israeli forces began to be attacked from all sides. The Israeli forces strengthened their military presence near the checkpoint, while the number of troops rose at a site near Abira. I believe that the clearance operation will commence soon. On the other hand, members of the Hezbollah terrorist organization began to launch rockets and mortars at 4 different locations along Lebanon's southern border. They intended to target Israeli tanks and border outposts, but as soon as the initial attacks began, fighter jets were sent. With the deployment of the jets, all Hezbollah camps in southern Lebanon were targeted once more. As the number of strikes grew, the Hezbollah organization's attacks decreased. However, as previously said, intelligence indications indicate that Hezbollah may declare war at noon on Friday. Meanwhile, we know Yemen has formally declared war on Israel. In the evening, 4 cruise missiles were launched from Yemen into Israel, with 3 of them being intercepted by air defense systems. It was announced that an Israeli Army F-35 destroyed the last cruise missile in the air, although tensions have grown significantly since the siege was lifted. We have entered the war's most critical phase. The Israeli army is understandably concealing the nature of its plan. However, urban warfare is extremely deadly. Following this, progress will be made through 3 major points. According to Israeli officials, operations will continue until the terrorist organization Hamas is entirely eliminated. It is useful to declare unequivocally that the coming week is critical. I believe that once the blockade is lifted, all Hamas targets will be targeted by airstrikes. However, there are several traps and tunnels throughout Gaza. This makes urban combat extremely difficult. We'll see what kind of approach we can devise together. Here we are at the end of another video that will be released in the coming hours. We will continue to provide you with timely and accurate information on the events. We will continue to present the events objectively to you. You may help us by liking the videos. You can also subscribe to the channel to keep up with new videos. I wish you all a joyful day. I'll see you shortly.